The first time the new maid raised her hand to stop the billionaire's bride from slapping her, the entire hall froze. No one in that mansion had ever dared to do that before. The staff standing along the marble corridor held their breath, the air felt heavy, and somewhere behind them a glass tray quietly slipped from someone's hands and shattered on the floor. But the maid did not move. She stood there calmly, her white gloves still raised in the air, gently but firmly blocking the bride's hand. For months everyone in that house had lived in fear of one woman. Her name was Victoria Sterling, the soon-to-be wife of billionaire Alexander Grant. She was beautiful, elegant, and terrifying. Her temper could turn a quiet morning into a storm in seconds. Servants were fired without warning. Assistants were humiliated in front of everyone. Even managers avoided speaking to her directly. The mansion staff whispered about her when she was not around, but the moment her heels echoed through the marble halls, silence followed. People lowered their heads and tried to disappear. The mansion itself looked like something out of a movie. Tall glass windows, golden stair rails, huge crystal chandeliers hanging above polished floors. It was the kind of place where every detail showed power and wealth. Yet behind those walls, most employees worked under constant tension. One wrong word could cost someone their job. That morning the atmosphere had been even worse. Victoria was preparing for an important charity event that evening, and when she was stressed, everyone else paid the price. A young assistant had already been sent home in tears, and 2 cleaners were scolded loudly in front of the kitchen staff. The new maid had only arrived 3 days earlier. Her name was Elena. She was quiet, polite, and kept mostly to herself. She was in her late 20s, with calm eyes and a soft voice that rarely rose above a whisper. Most of the staff noticed that she worked carefully and never complained, even when given the most exhausting tasks. No one knew much about her past. The employment agency simply said she had experience working in private homes and needed a job urgently. And now she stood in the middle of the hall, her hand raised calmly, blocking the bride of the most powerful man in the city. Victoria's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment she looked more shocked than angry. "Did you just touch me?" she said slowly, her voice dangerously quiet. The other servants felt their stomachs tighten. They had seen this look before. It was the look Victoria had right before someone lost their job. Elena slowly lowered her hand but did not step back. Her voice remained calm. "I stopped your hand, ma'am," she said gently. Victoria let out a sharp laugh that echoed through the hall. "You stopped my hand," she repeated. "Do you have any idea who you are speaking to?" Elena nodded slightly. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria's face hardened. "Then you should also know that I can have you fired in less than 5 minutes. The other staff members stared at the floor. They expected Elena to apologize immediately, maybe even beg to keep her job. But Elena did something unexpected. She simply stood there quietly. "I am aware of that, ma'am," she said softly. Victoria stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "Then perhaps you should explain why you thought it was acceptable to touch me." Elena's eyes moved briefly toward the young kitchen assistant standing behind her. The girl's cheek was red and her eyes were filled with tears. She could not have been older than 19. Elena looked back at Victoria. "Because you were about to hurt her, ma'am," she said calmly. The silence that followed felt endless. Victoria's expression turned cold again. "That is none of your concern. It is my house. My staff. I can discipline them however I choose." Elena said nothing for a moment. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. Then she spoke quietly. "Respect should not depend on power." A few servants exchanged nervous glances. Victoria stared at her as if she had just heard the most ridiculous statement in the world. "Respect," she said slowly, "is something people earn." Elena nodded slightly. "That is true, ma'am. But fear is not the same thing." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. For a second it looked like she might actually slap Elena this time. Instead she turned sharply toward the house manager who had been standing near the staircase. "Fire her," she said coldly. Immediately. The manager hesitated. He had worked in the mansion for nearly 15 years, but even he never questioned Victoria's orders. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly. Elena lowered her gaze slightly, as if she had expected this outcome all along. She did not argue. She simply removed her gloves and placed them neatly on a nearby table. The young assistant behind her whispered something through tears, but Elena gently shook her head. It's all right, she said softly. Sometimes doing the right thing has a cost. As she began walking toward the exit, the large doors at the end of the hall suddenly opened. Footsteps echoed inside the mansion. The staff instantly recognized the sound. Alexander Grant had returned earlier than expected. Conversations stopped immediately. Alexander was known for being calm and reserved, the opposite of Victoria's fiery personality. He rarely raised his voice, and when he did, people listened. He walked into the hall and paused when he noticed the unusual silence. His eyes moved across the room and then stopped. He had just seen the moment Elena gently holding Victoria's wrist to stop the slap. The red circle drawn around him in the picture would make sense now. He had been standing there longer than anyone realized. "What is going on here?" he asked calmly. Victoria turned toward him, instantly shifting her tone. "Oh, Alexander, perfect timing," she said with a tight smile. "This maid decided to interfere with my business. I'm having her dismissed." Alexander's gaze moved to Elena. She stood quietly near the door, holding her small bag, her posture straight despite everything that had just happened. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he walked slowly across the hall. His eyes moved to the frightened assistant whose cheek was still red. Then back to Elena. "Did you stop Victoria from hitting her?" he asked quietly. Elena nodded once. "Yes, sir." Victoria crossed her arms. "She touched me without permission, Alexander. In my own house." Alexander looked at her calmly. Then he looked at Elena again. "Why did you do it?" he asked. Elena hesitated slightly before answering. "Because no one else would, sir." The hall became silent again. Something about her words seemed to settle deeply into the room. Alexander studied her face carefully. Then he asked something unexpected. "Have we met before?" Elena blinked, surprised by the question. "No, sir," she replied softly. Alexander's expression changed slightly, as if he were remembering something from long ago. "When I was 16, he said slowly, my father collapsed on the street outside our old apartment. Everyone walked past him. No one stopped. Except one woman. She stayed with him until the ambulance arrived. She saved his life that day." Elena's eyes lowered quietly. Alexander continued speaking, his voice softer now. "I never forgot her face." There was a long pause. Then Elena looked up again. "That woman was my mother," she said quietly. The staff looked at each other in shock. Alexander nodded slowly. "I thought so." He turned toward the house manager. "Cancel the dismissal." The manager blinked in confusion. "Sir." Alexander's voice remained calm but firm. "Elena is not being fired. She is being promoted." Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Promoted? To what exactly?" Alexander answered without hesitation. "To head of household staff." The silence in the hall felt almost unreal. Victoria's face turned pale with anger. "Alexander, this is absurd. She humiliated me in front of the staff." Alexander finally looked directly at her. "No," he said quietly. "She showed courage when everyone else was afraid. There is a difference." Victoria opened her mouth but no words came out. For the first time since entering that mansion, someone had challenged her authority. And it had happened in front of everyone. Elena stood quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Alexander looked at her once more and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said softly. "Not just for today, but for years ago." Sometimes kindness travels in circles. Sometimes it returns when people least expect it. And in that moment, inside the grand marble hall where fear had ruled for so long, something quietly changed. Respect had entered the room for the first time.